Bitcoin. You might not be familiar with it, but you might have heard of it every once in a while, especially recently with the price blasting past $6,000 each when it was only a fraction of that even earlier in the year. And some financial experts are even speculating that the price of Bitcoin could go up to $25,000 each within a few years. Some people even making crazy predictions of $100,000, but that's not what this video is about. We're going to be talking about really what Bitcoin is. If you're not super familiar with the technology behind it, I'm going to try to explain it in a way that's easy to understand while not getting too super technical. Now, I'll admit in the past, I didn't really understand Bitcoin. I thought it was just stupid. I didn't understand what it was, why it was worth any money, and I just thought people were making up this coin like any other, I don't know, video game currency or something. But if you actually look into the technology behind it, it actually can be pretty exciting, and there are actual several uses besides just money that could actually be implemented in the future big time. So first, let's get into the basics of the blockchain technology, which is the core of any cryptocurrency, and why it's so really novel and unique. And the idea is that a blockchain is kind of like a ledger. You can think of it like a list of transactions that is public and permanent, that no one can ever change. And for that reason, it's very reliable. So once you put a transaction on there that Bob sent $5 to Jill, then that transaction is going to be on there forever. And when you add up all these transactions, eventually when you get to the current time, then the net result will say, well, this person now has this amount of money in their account. That's the very simple version of it. But this blockchain technology is not just useful for money, because yes, it is useful for that, where, you know, if you want to send a transaction, it's kind of like a permanent receipt that you can point to, and every transaction is permanent. So you can actually go online and look up the transaction and say, yep, here's where I sent this amount of money to this other person. But there's also other uses where you might want something to be permanently public, such as maybe a will, where normally you go to a lawyer and you write up a will, and then, if I'm not mistaken, that lawyer keeps a copy of the will and basically says, yep, I witness that this person actually wrote this will. But if you had a blockchain and you put your will on the blockchain and you signed it in a way that proved that you're the one that made this, then that is going to be on the blockchain forever. And then now, whenever you pass away, your will is going to be on there, and no one can ever debate that you didn't write that, because it was made and finalized at that time and is still on that blockchain. Another really good example would be voting. So there's so much talk about voting fraud, and whether someone made a vote and whether it was not really their vote or multiple votes or something like that. Whereas if there were to be a voting on a blockchain using blockchain technology, then every single vote would be permanently recorded, and you would also be able to see where that vote originated. So everyone would get a vote, and you could say, well, this person voted in this way. And also, because it's public, anyone who wanted to audit the vote and check for themselves, they could just do it. They could download the whole blockchain and look at each individual vote and look for anything fishy. And it's not like you rely on the government to say, yep, we double checked and yeah, we won, so you don't have to worry about it. We checked. You could check yourself. Another example might be business contracts. So you could say, yep, here's where we agreed to anything, and it's not like you rely on a paper contract that was in an email that got lost and then it's hearsay. You have that contract permanently on the blockchain, and then you don't have to worry about it. And it could be encrypted, so only the people who know the passcode to the text on the blockchain, but it's still up there as proof. And yet another example would be identification. So instead of having to carry around an ID to prove who you are, theoretically, if you got pulled into the police station and you had to prove who you were, then you could say, well, here's my identification number on the blockchain or something, and then anyone could look that up And yeah, that's kind of like the same idea behind a police database, but you get the idea. You could put your birth certificate on there, so if you lose your birth certificate, it still exists out there. And yeah, there's some privacy. You wouldn't really want anyone else to get access to a birth certificate, but there are uses like that you can probably imagine. Then there's also the idea of a smart contract, which I can kind of touch on later. And the idea is, with that, the blockchain itself will initiate an action based on a contract. So you could say, I want to send Bob this amount of money in 10 days, and then the blockchain will do that automatically, and that transaction will say, okay, this amount of money will now be available in Bob's account 10 days from now. And you know that's going to happen because it's on the blockchain, and that transaction happened 10 days ago and was finalized. So if Bill, who's sending the money, wants to go back on it, he can't. So clearly, based on these examples, it's not just money that you would use for these different cryptocurrencies, and that's why there are really two different categories you could consider. There's cryptocurrencies and crypto tokens, and the second would be more for things where it's not just based on sending money to one person, but it actually has another purpose. Another example is Ethereum, which is a very popular platform, not necessarily a cryptocurrency, although it is worth money. So it can do smart contracts like I kind of talked about before, and there's even a way to build your own coins off of that called an ICO, initial coin offering. Most of those are garbage, just be aware, but it's kind of like a way where developers can raise money for a project they want to do and issue a coin, and it's all built upon the Ethereum platform using smart contracts. But the reason it is worth money as well, even though it's not strictly a cryptocurrency, is because each blockchain has to use computer power to keep itself running and keep these transactions confirmed and keep the blockchain building. And no one's going to spend money to keep this thing going if there's no monetary incentive. So when you do mining on this blockchain to keep building it, you're issued rewards in the form of additional tokens. And that's why it has to be worth money. So basically, you can exchange computer power to keep this thing running, and the value of the entire platform is split up into tokens. So theoretically, as long as the entire platform has usefulness, then it has value, and it's worth it to keep mining and building it. Now, one of the other major components of the blockchain is how the blockchain is built and added to, which is done through mining. You need miners who are basically people who use their computer power to run calculations and build on this blockchain. And it's a distributed network, and it's run on consensus. So the more computer power that's distributed around the world working on this blockchain, then theoretically the harder it is to falsify something, because you would need a ton of computer power to overcome the consensus from all the legitimate computer power from all the miners. So here's a very simplified version of how it works. It's not exact. People are going to kind of get mad that I'm not going super into detail, but here's the idea. So say you want to send Bob $5. You enter that ledger, you kind of send it to the Bitcoin network and say, okay, here's my address, and I'm going to send it to this other address owned by Bob, and I'm sending $5. And you send that, and that kind of gets added to a queue that is now going to be added to the ledger. Now, as this is happening, miners are constantly running calculations and working on the blockchain, and every once in a while, there are chunks that are added to the blockchain. So the reason it's called a blockchain is it's a chain of blocks or parts, each consisting of a certain size of data, and each gets added to the other. So you need the entire thing, theoretically, to see the current state of the blockchain, because you need to know where it ended up, everything that happened in between to get to where you are now. So every time you do a transaction, you add it to this queue, which gets added to each block or part, and then once it's finalized, it gets added to the back and gets added on. But to finalize each block, you need to get a certain calculation. It's kind of encrypted. I'm very simplifying it here, but there's an encryption code, and eventually one miner will get it correct, and when they do that, that block is finalized when all the other miners confirm that yes, this calculation that this person did was right, and then they are rewarded with a certain number of Bitcoins for every block that they calculate correctly. And then once that happens, all the transactions in that block get finalized and solidified forever. So you can see why miners are essential to Bitcoin. They actually run the network. If all the miners disappeared and stopped, then there would be no one running these calculations. No one would be able to finalize each block, and then the whole blockchain would basically die, and everyone would not be able to ever send any more Bitcoin because it's done. Now, one thing to know is there is a finite number of Bitcoin. 21 million is the maximum number of Bitcoin. So you might think, wait a minute, what happens if Bitcoin runs out? Then the miners are going to stop mining and it's done. Well, that's not true, because also when you go to send a transaction, there's also a fee that also goes to miners. So after the Bitcoin all get the rewards used up from mining blocks, then they'll still keep adding blocks, and they'll get the fees from the transactions in each block. Also, another thing to note is you might think, wait a minute, if more computer power is added every year, then that's gonna mean that pretty soon the blocks are just gonna get calculated super fast and it's gonna run out very quickly. And the answer to that is actually there's a thing called difficulty. So the more computer power that is added to the Bitcoin network, the more difficult it actually becomes to mine each block. So it auto adjusts. So theoretically, it doesn't matter how much computer power is added, it'll just become more and more difficult, so it'll kind of cancel each other out. Also, to make sure that the Bitcoins that do exist last a very long time, every once in a while, the number of Bitcoins that you're rewarded reduces for each block. And it's actually predicted that the last Bitcoin will be mined in the year 2140. So over 100 years from now. So clearly we're not going to run out anytime soon, although it will get less and less actual Bitcoin rewards for mining, and they'll more and more rely on the transaction fees. As another side note, yes, there is a very limited number of Bitcoin, but you don't have to buy a whole Bitcoin. You can buy a very, very small fraction of a Bitcoin. So it's not like, oh, well, I can't afford a Bitcoin, I'm never gonna have one. No, you can buy 1,000th of a Bitcoin, 10,000th of a Bitcoin, and just use it that way. So why don't we talk about issues with Bitcoin? Because yeah, there's great things about it, but also there are some things you definitely might want to watch out for if you're interested in it. There's some problems I see with it that make it very difficult for the average non-computer savvy person to really get into it. First of all, there's a lot of ways you can screw up with Bitcoin and maybe lose it. For example, if you send your Bitcoin to the wrong Bitcoin address, there's no way to get it back. It's done. So if you type in a wrong letter or you send it to the wrong person, you won't even theoretically know who received that, or you might have sent it to a blank address that's not owned by anyone, and in both cases, you will never get access to it again, and possibly no one ever in the world will ever get access to it again, and it's gone into the ether forever. The other thing to note is you're storing your Bitcoins on a so-called wallet, which is basically just a private key that essentially lets you prove that you have access to the coins and you own the coins that are corresponding to a certain address on the blockchain. So you use that private key to basically sign and say, yeah, only the person who would have this private key would be able to generate this string, this is very simplified, that would say that they have access to this on the blockchain. So if you lose that string, that key, then there's no way you can prove that you own those coins on the blockchain. So you can see them up there, but you can never spend them. They're gone forever. Or if someone steals that number that you have to keep private, if they take a picture of it, you keep it stored on your computer, and a virus comes along and takes it, then they essentially now have your money. So it's almost like cash. If someone steals cash out of your wallet, there's no way you can get it back. You know, it's gone forever. You can't see it, it's done, except it's kind of like a virtual version of cash where if someone gets your private key, it's like they're stealing your wallet virtually, except you can't get it back because they already sent it to someone else and now it's gone. And that is what I personally think is the biggest issue with Bitcoin in terms of going mainstream, is it's very hard to get right, to store securely. Because like I said, if you lose your Bitcoin, if someone steals it, you send it the wrong address, there's no bank customer service that you can call up. There's no credit card company that you can call up and do a chargeback. it's gone forever. So I think a lot of people would rather just not deal with that. They don't want to have to worry about securing their own money when they can just go to a bank. They'd rather be able to even pay money to have their money in the bank and then just be able to have someone to call up. Whereas if they had to store it on Bitcoin, well, that's just one more thing they have to worry about someone not stealing. And also, if you think about it, with regular money, if someone steals your money or hacks into your bank account, you can typically go to the government, you can go to the police, and they can go help you get it back. There's institutions in place meant to get people's money back if it's something goes wrong. Whereas with Bitcoin, there's no government behind it. It's decentralized. No one runs it. So there's nowhere you can go for help. You're completely dependent on yourself. For some people, they really like that about Bitcoin. That's the best thing ever about Bitcoin. But for other people, they don't want to have to worry about it. They would rather be reliant on someone else and trust other people with their own money than they would. And that's fine, but that's also one reason why I'm not sure Bitcoin will ever be the completely dominant currency like a lot of people say without some major changes. So essentially, to be really secure with Bitcoin, you have to store that private key in a way that no one will ever get access to it. So if you print it out on a piece of paper, you would want to generate it on a computer that was maybe never connected to the internet in case there was a virus on it. And then you would store that piece of paper in a safe, but then you'd also want to keep copies that no one would also be able to get access to, like in a safe deposit box. So there's a lot of things to consider. And also in terms of screwing up, even if someone doesn't steal your Bitcoin, like I said, there's plenty of ways you could lose it. You could lose that piece of paper that had the money on it and you're done. You can't ever get it back. Or if your computer crashes and you didn't make a backup or something like that, then it's also gone. Now, with all that being said, if you know what you're doing, if you're willing to put in the work to secure the key, to make sure no virus can ever access it, then yeah, it probably would be fine. But you do need to prepare yourself and be aware of all the issues so that you don't get blindsided by something and then you're screwed. Now, with all this talk about Bitcoin, you might be wondering how it's gonna look in the future. And there's so many people with a lot of ideas, whether it's Bitcoin replacing all money and being a world currency, which I personally don't think is gonna happen for a lot of the reasons I said before, unless there's some fundamental changes to it. And there's also people who, personally like me, think that, it'll be another way to do transactions, maybe a different store of value, but it won't be the only thing. So one real example might be in countries where there's a very unstable currency, where the currency is very unreliable, then people might start using Bitcoin instead because the money is not reliable. People literally don't want the money. One real world example is Zimbabwe. If you weren't aware, Zimbabwe had some huge hyperinflation, which led to the money becoming literally worthless. And just as a funny illustration, I have here some real Zimbabwe currency. You can see that this is a stack of billion-dollar bills. These are real issued bills by the Zimbabwe government before this money was decommissioned, and the money became so worthless that they had to issue billion-dollar bills, and this wouldn't even buy you a loaf of bread. So it's kind of funny in that situation, if people had Bitcoin, that would be worth way more than whatever money the government was issuing. So even though I don't think that would happen in a highly developed country like the United States, where really the whole world uses the US dollar, I could see that happening in small communities or countries that really need it. Another use could be literally just a store of value, kind of like gold. Gold isn't particularly useful in the sense that you can hold it and do anything with it, but people kind of agree that gold is worth money. So also with Bitcoin, it can hold its value because there's a finite number of Bitcoins. You can't mine more than 21 million. And also, if you think about it, the overall possible total supply of Bitcoin kind of goes down because of people who lose their wallets or send it to the wrong address. And those Bitcoins are gone forever. No one will ever have access to it again. So really right now, the total possible number of Bitcoins that people will ever be able to use is less than 21 million, probably significantly less. Now you might be wondering, well, where do I get this Bitcoin? You want to buy some. And before I say anything else, I definitely want to say, never put more money into Bitcoin than you're willing to lose. At this point, Bitcoin is so volatile. It's very, very new. It's almost like a gamble right now. So don't put your life savings into it. Yeah, it could go up. it could also go down. The government could literally ban Bitcoin, make it illegal. And yeah, it's decentralized, so you can't really ban it from people from using it permanently. But if exchanges, which I'm going to talk about in a bit, can't operate, then the price is going to go down either way. You're going to lose a lot of money in any case. Now, to actually buy Bitcoin, you go to an exchange, kind of like a stock exchange. It's basically a company that will sell you Bitcoin and send it to your wallet, or kind of let you keep it in an account on their website, and you pay them money. Very simple. Probably the biggest Bitcoin exchange, at least in the United States, is Coinbase. It's pretty reputable. An advantage of keeping your Bitcoin in an exchange is you don't have to worry about all the security. Yes, you have to obviously worry about securing it on your account, your password, two-factor authentication in that sense, but you don't have to, put your coins or your code in a safe and make sure no one steals it, or worry about having a fire and losing it, or putting it in a safety deposit box. You can assume and put your trust into this big company and just worry about securing your account. It's a lot easier for people. Now, the downside of keeping it in an exchange, kind of the flip side of that, you don't have access to your private key. So you don't technically own that wallet that has the money in it. They basically give you an IOU that says, yes, you own these Bitcoins, but until you actually send it to your address, you don't actually possess them. So if for some reason that Bitcoin exchange gets shut down by the government, or it turns out they were stealing it all along, there was a Ponzi scheme, well, you don't have access to that money anymore. You never did, and you can't extract it because you didn't control that private key. You didn't control those Bitcoins, because the private key is those Bitcoins. Another thing to note is if you go in an exchange and keep your Bitcoins on there, then Bitcoins are not insured by the government. Like in the United States, we have FDIC, which means that if you keep your money in a bank account and that bank runs out of money, then the government will give you your money back. It's insured. But with Bitcoin, that doesn't happen. So if that exchange runs out of money or it all gets stolen, they might have an insurance policy with an insurance company that will say they can pay you back, but that's not a guarantee. It might not all be insured, and you have a good chance of just losing that forever, and that's the likely case. Though I should point out that on Coinbase, if you keep your money in a US dollar account instead of keeping it in Bitcoins, they do insure that part. So if you have $5,000 on Coinbase, but you didn't spend it on Bitcoin yet, then if everything gets shut down, that is FDIC insured just like a regular bank, just not the Bitcoins. So to sum up those points, storing your Bitcoin on an exchange is a lot easier, no doubt, and definitely easier for beginners and probably safer for people who have no idea what they're doing, but at the same time, you're relying on the trust of that company. So on the flip side, you might be wondering, well then how do I store Bitcoins myself? And I'm not gonna get super in depth of this. You could go on all day about how to do it. I'm gonna give you some basic examples to start with, and then you can look up these methods yourself. One method is what's called a paper wallet that I kind of mentioned before, and that is where you would generate a private key, and that would just be your wallet, and you would print that out and store that somewhere very safe. And you would want to generate this key using Bitcoin software on a computer that is never connected to the internet, ideally. So if that computer has a virus on it while you generate it, it gets captured, and then someone keeps your private key and keeps an eye on it, so whenever you deposit money, then they just take it right out. So that's another big issue for keeping it safe. You might not even know if someone has it. But if you generate it correctly, a paper wallet could be one of the most secure methods, because the only way for someone to get those Bitcoins is to physically steal that piece of paper or look at it somehow and take a picture, which they wouldn't hopefully be able to do if you have it stored away. But probably the best balance of security and convenience is what's called a hardware wallet. There are actually products out there such as Ledger Nano S or the Trezor wallet. These are companies that make hardware wallets, which are devices which store the private key where you don't even need to know the private key. It's stored on the device. It never leaves the device. And those transactions are signed on the device, goes through USB, and it's secured in a way where even if there's a virus on the computer, it still would never be able to access that device's private key. And that device would also have something like a passcode. So if someone steals the device, unlike a paper wallet where all they have to do is literally look at it, then they wouldn't be able to access any of your funds because they need to type in the passcode to even use it. And when you do this, the private key is generated with a so-called seed, which is a bunch of different words. So when you go to generate this key on your hardware wallet, you write down this recovery seed, which is a bunch of different words, either 12 or 24, and if you ever lost your hardware wallet, even though you never saw your private key because it's stored securely on there, you would be able to use those words to get your private key and get access to all your money again. But again, you need to store those words as securely as you would as a private key itself. So basically you have access to your money where you can actually use it at home and no one can really steal it unless they have the passcode, but you can store it as a backup somewhere like a safety deposit box if you ever lose it at home. All right, so I think that's the gist of what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to kind of keep it simple, but also make it really easy to understand how everything works. So if you never used Bitcoin before, or you never heard of it even, then hopefully by now you should have a better understanding of how it works. And if you are a Bitcoin enthusiast already and you like this video, you think it's beneficial, you can always feel free to leave me a tip. I'll put my public donation key in the description. So that's one benefit right there. You can kind of receive payments publicly and no one can actually access all my funds through the public key because they don't have my private key. So if you want to send me a few bucks, feel free. But of course, I'm always happy enough just if you guys want to keep watching and subscribe. I'll put some other videos right here. You can just click on those. And if you do want to subscribe, I make new videos every Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. And also consider enabling notifications or else YouTube might not show you videos at all anyway. You can just click the bell. I'm looking forward to hearing from you guys down in the comments section. So let me know what you think. And as usual, I'll see you next time. Have a good one.